Ma'am, this Ms. DeMarte, this MCMI score or test, first of all, do you know what norming is? What does that mean?
Norming is just a reference group. It allows us, whenever there's a test taker, we can compare their test scores against the average normative reference group population.
This MCMI, this test, do you know what population it was normed against?
Yes.
And what was it normed against?
It's normed against what's called the clinical population. These were individuals who were seeking treatment or I believe it was treatment in an outpatient setting or inpatient setting. So these were individuals who are already identified as having a psychological disorder.
So if you are looking at the results that we have in this case, for example, in exhibit number 553, are they being compared against the non-symptomatic population, or are they being compared against a population that has already been determined to have some sort of mental health issue?
A population that's been determined to have mental health issues.
So if we're trying to take a look at an individual such as Ms. Arias, in your opinion, why would we need to look at her behavior in comparison with somebody who has psychiatric issues, or has mental health issues already? Is that a problem, or is that something that you can do?
Well, I've used the MCMI myself before when I was working at the state hospital, and I found it to be very helpful because at that time I was working with individuals who were already deemed to have a psychological disorder. In a situation like this, my job was to determine whether there was a psychological disorder that was present. And the way that we do that is we look at symptom patterns and see how do they differentiate from the average person. So because of that, I would choose not to use a test like this.
And you have used this test in the past, correct?
Yes.
Now, are you familiar with the materials and the approach taken by Alice Laviolette?
Yes.
What approach did she take with regard to this case in the evaluation?
She took a different approach, a much more subjective approach, in that there was no testing that was conducted. There was no report that was written, so there was nothing, excuse me, there was nothing for me to read, any report that she wrote, any test data so that I can compare.
And so when you say that this was a much more subjective approach, is there something out there, for example, you were talking about these tests involving Ms. Karp and Dr. Karp and Dr. Samuels, you were told about these tests that you could actually run and compare yourself, right?
That's correct.
But with regard to Ms. Laviolette, is there any objective way that you could go back and look at something to say, oh, I see, this is how she reached the result, and I've been able to verify that result?
No, there was no report, there was no test data.
So what is it that she did then?
What she did is review.
Assumption, experience, relevance, speculation, lack of knowledge.
Approach.
Sustained.
With regard to Alice LaViolette, were you provided any materials that she created, such as notes?
Objection has to be answered.
Overruled.
I was provided with notes.
Were you also provided with an interview that she conducted in November of 2012 with the prosecutor? The audio tape.
Oh, the audio tape, yes.
And did you review that audio tape?
Yes.
And did you take a look at the notes that were provided to you?
Yes.
Did you, for example, the audio tape, did she discuss the approach that she took in this case?
Yes.
And with regard to her approach that she discussed, what was your understanding of the approach that she took?
She interviewed Miss Arias and she looked at records.
And with regard to the approach as a psychologist, what is your opinion as to the validity of that approach?
Objection, foundation.
Overruled.
There's a big piece of missing data there, which is giving tests.
Okay, and so what would the test have done?
It adds another objective measure.
And in this case, isn't that at all, correct?
Can you say that again?
There isn't any testing that she did, correct?
That's correct.
But how would that be important to Alice LaViolette's approach?
It's another.
Objection, Judge, lack of foundation with regard to domestic violence.
Overruled.
You may continue.
It's another piece of data that would be able to be incorporated so that it's not just information that's coming directly from Miss Arias in a clinical interview.
And for example, in this case, are you familiar with the fact that there have been changing stories with regard to the defendant and events involved in this case?
Yes.
If that were the case, that there are this changing stories about the events, does that add anything, or does that raise a red flag to you with regard to the approach that Alice LaViolette used?
Absolutely. If there's inconsistencies with Miss Arias's report, then we have to be concerned about which information that she gives us is accurate or not. So the more data points that we have to make a final conclusion, the more accurate it will be.
Ma'am, in Exhibit 600, one of the things that was discussed, for example, with Alice LaViolette was, and it's a instant message between Reagan Housley and Travis Alexander, and according to Alice LaViolette, that was on May 19th of 2008. In it, Mr. Alexander indicates that he is extreme.
Objection beyond the scope. Beyond rebuttal.
Overruled.
He indicates that he is extremely afraid of the defendant because of her stalking behavior. And one of the things that Alice LaViolette told us was that, well, she didn't believe him. And she gave her reasons for that. Do you see anything in her approach, the approach that you are familiar with, do you see anything in her approach that would give her or you or anybody the ability to go behind the words and pass on the truthfulness or untruthfulness of that statement?
Objection is characterized as Ms. LaViolette's testimony.
Overruled. You may answer the question.
This is one piece of data that can be used as objective, and it can be used amongst with everything else that is collected. There's nothing that you can say it's in written word. It was given. You use it as a piece of data. And
So saying that you don't believe it, for example, her saying that she didn't believe it, and you...
Objection is characterized as the testimony.
The jury is directed to recall the evidence provided previously in this trial by the witness. You may continue.
With regard to whether or not this is something to be believed, does her approach lend itself to being able to make an assessment of when somebody is being truthful or untruthful just by looking at the written word, the objective data?
what that does is it changes objective data into subjective data.
And what do you mean that it changes it over to subjective data? What does that mean?
That if you were to give that same written word to somebody else, they may subjectively interpret it different rather than looking at it for what it is. If the words say something, that's what the words mean.
And so if you have the changing of the data, of the objective data, morphing over to subjective data, what does that tell you under this approach, or does that tell you anything about the ultimate conclusion or opinion that is rendered based on this subjective interpretation of the words?
Objection, lack of foundation.
Approach, please. Overruled.
Ma'am, with regard to this subjectification, I know that's probably not a word, but taking the objective word and turning it subjective, if you will, and knowing the approach that was used with regard to Ms. Laviolette, and I'm just talking about not anything specific, but the actual opinion that may be rendered on this type of approach. Is that something that you believe would lead to a valid opinion if you are taking words that are objective and then making them subjective?
It's unreliable.
And why is it unreliable?
Because in that situation, then there would be no objective data that's being relied upon. Then that would mean that the approach is completely subjective.
So, for example, if we go back to exhibit number 456 that we've talked about already, and the approach were to change or make subjective what is written there in the first sentence, would your opinion then, would it be a valid opinion, irrespective of what the opinion is? Do you believe it would be a valid opinion if you were to read, for example, the journals and then change the words? Would that still render, in your opinion, a valid opinion?
Objection is characterized as a testimony as to changing the words in the journal.
Overruled. You may answer.
It would make it subjective and unreliable.
Is there, for example, any course that you've ever taken when you were studying to become a psychologist that indicates that that is an appropriate approach in a forensic evaluation?
No.
You indicated that you did administer some tests, and I think that you indicated that you administered one, the TSI, and we've talked about that, right?
Correct.
You also administered other tests, right?
Correct.
What are the other tests?
I administered what's called the abbreviation for it is RAT, a Wide Range Achievement Test.
Well, let's talk about that one before we get done with the acronyms. The RAT, or W-R-A-T, why did you administer that?
The self-report measures, such as the TSI and another test that I gave, which is referred to as the MMPI, there's certain reading thresholds that are required in order for someone to take the test independently. So I wanted to make sure that Ms. Arias met that threshold so that I could give her the test and that it would be valid.
So in other words, you wanted to see, as what appears to be saying, you wanted to see if she could read at a certain level, right?
So I gave her the reading subtest.
Right, and that's the W-R-A-T. That tells you that she could read and could take the other tests, right?
Those were my findings.
And how is that test put together? I mean, does it just ask questions, or explain a little bit about that test.
It's a very brief reading test. It's just a matter of presenting her with a list of words and asking her to read it out loud to me.
All right. Then what other tests did you administer?
I also administered what's called the WAIS. It's an intelligence test.
And that's WAIS.
Correct.
Do you know what that acronym stands for?
Wexler Adult Intelligence.
And why were you, what does this test measure? What is it that it's measuring?
It's a test of overall intelligence.
And so you administered it. Are you familiar with the term IQ?
Yes, it's the same as intelligence.
And so this is an IQ test?
That is correct.
And this IQ test, is it just one straight IQ, or is it divided into 4 subparts? Or explain to me about this.
Sure. The way that the test works is that there's an overall intelligence IQ of the individual, and there are 4 different domains that comprise this overall intelligence score.
And what are the 4 domains that are involved?
There's one domain called verbal comprehension, essentially the person's ability to verbally formulate words, their word knowledge.
How about the other domains?
Another one is called the perceptual reasoning domain. You can think about it as someone's ability to put together puzzles. So it's essentially nonverbal intelligence.
The third?
Another is called working memory, the ability to take in different pieces of information and keep it in your short-term memory while you utilize that information in some sort of way.
And with regard to this short-term memory test, what result did you get?
She performed well on it.
Was there ever an indication there that somehow she had any problems such that her memory was affected?
No.
How about the last one?
The last domain is called processing speed. Essentially what that tells us is how fast someone can think.
So what was her overall score or IQ score?
She scored relatively high in the above average range.
And what was that score, do you know?
May I reference my records?
Sure, just give it to me, however.
I'm going to object to beyond rebuttal, not rebuttal.
Overruled.
Take a look at Exhibit 621, review it. Once you've reviewed it, please give it back. What was the overall IQ score?
The overall IQ is 119.
And did she achieve a score on any of these 4 domains that was in the very superior range?
Yes, and the first domain that I described was the verbal comprehension.
And what did she score there?
I believe it's 136.
Take a look at it. Okay. And when you say that's very superior, what does that mean?
Objection, not rebuttal.
Overruled.
What does that mean?
It's the highest possible that you can get in terms of descriptor domains, so it's very high.
Did you also administer another test?
Yes,
What was that?
what's called the MMPI,
And what does that stand for?
the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory.
And personality inventory, what is it that test is supposed to measure?
The MMPI is one of the most commonly used tests in forensic settings and overall. It's a measure of general psychopathology, so the presence of mental illness, and general personality characteristics.
Is that normed against the general population, or is that normed against those that have mental health issues and may be in a facility?
The normative population is an average typical group.
So, and you say that it's personality. What is it that, when you say personality, what is it that it's looking at?
Well, personality characteristics that we all have within us, and it's how we relate to people, it's how we relate to the world. It's carried within us at all times. It's who we are. It's what makes us up as people.
So with regard to personality, for example, if the prosecutor, let's just assume somebody's a jerk, for lack of a better term, is that personality, is there such a thing as being a jerk?
And not using that verbiage.
Overruled.
Ma'am, we were talking about this issue involving, well, Mike, can you read that back? The question. All right, I'll go ahead and just ask.
I'll look for it.
We were talking about MMPI. Let's talk about the MMPI. One of the things that we were talking about was personality in terms of the MMPI, correct?
That's correct.
And in terms of a personality, and I started to say jerk. Do you remember that?
Yes.
With regard to personality, when does an individual, and you said that jerk isn't exactly what you mean, what is it exactly that you mean with regard to a personality?
I was just saying that that's not a terminology that I would use.
Okay, what would be the terminology that you would use?
A potential personality trait would be aggressiveness.
All right, so if you have let's say aggressiveness, would manipulation or being manipulated, is that a character trait?
Yes.
So let's say that, for example, when does this personality trait start for an individual? Does it start when they're 30? Does it start when they're 15? When do these personality traits start?
Personality is developed throughout life. It's thought to develop relatively early as a child, and it's referred to as temperament, then develops into personality. So we could see it at a very, very young age.
When you say very, very young age, what do the studies show is a very, very young age?
Starting from toddler years, that's the beginnings of it, and continues to develop throughout childhood, adolescence, and becomes much more firm in adulthood.
How is that different from, let's say, somebody who is in a situation that is not such a good situation, and they're depressed because of that situation? Is that the same thing as a characteristic?
No, that would be much more situational, and I would determine the difference between that by looking at patterns of behavior.
So are you familiar with the terms Axis 1 and Axis 2?
Yes.
What is Axis 1?
There's a diagnostic system that's used in the Diagnostical and Statistical Manual, so essentially what we use to make diagnoses. Axis 1 disorders are thought to be much more transient disorders. They're called clinical disorders. That's not necessarily the case for everything that falls under Axis 1, but it differentiates from Axis 2 in that Axis 2 captures what are called personality disorders, in addition to other spectrums that tend to be more long-lasting, like mental retardation.
So, for example, if somebody is in jail and they manifest a certain profile, is that an Axis 1 profile or an Axis 2 profile?
What profile are you referring to?
Well, let's talk about somebody who, let's say, is depressed and they're in jail. Is that a characteristic, or is that just a mood that may pass?
We're talking about personality. If there's no indication that there was any kind of depression in the past, then I would label it as non-personality.
And so the MMPI that we were talking about, it measures the personality, correct?
Right.
And how is that important in making an assessment in a forensic setting?
Because it gives me the opportunity to look at personality features that may be present in the individual in terms of in a maladaptive way.
When you say in a maladaptive way, what does that mean?
So, as a psychologist, when I diagnose someone with a personality disorder, what it means is that the personality trait has essentially become maladaptive. It's not helpful to them. It causes either distress with them or the people around them, or cause some sort of impairment in their life as a result of it.
And how many questions are involved in this MMPI?
There's a lot. There's 567.
And this administration of the test, explain to us how it is that you administer this test and whether or not there is a bubble sheet that's associated with this.
There's a answer sheet, and then there's the actual test itself with the test items. I gave it the answer sheet and both of the items to Miss Arias and asked her to complete it, and asked her to read the directions that are on there that indicate that she's to answer these true or false questions as they typically relate to who she is. Are they mostly true or mostly false of her?
Would you ever have a situation where you just, for example, read the test to her and then marked on a legal pad what the responses were, rather than using the bubble sheet?
No.
Have you ever done that?
No.
Do you know anybody that has ever done that?
No.
And so you did receive, once you get done with that, how is this scored? Do you do it manually, or how is that done?
Now, I put it through a computer system so as to ensure that there's no errors. It actually makes me score it twice to make sure that there was no error while I was entering it.
So once you get these scores, is it just one big score, let's say 100, 50, 75, like we saw with the MCMI, or is it something else? What do you get?
It's somewhat similar to the MCMI in that there's a number of different what are called scales that are identified on there.
Let me stop you there. When you say scales, are you talking about sections, for lack of a better term? Is it a section that you look at, or is it something else?
That's one way to look at it. It groups essentially the answers into meaningful categories. That's a better way. Categories such as depression or tendency to somaticize, meaning that experience psychological distress through somatic physical symptoms.
Are there what are called validity scales as part of this MMPI?
Yes, and that's one of the reasons why it's used so often in forensic settings. What a validity scale does is it tells us what the test taker's approach is, meaning that it tells us whether they're exaggerating their symptoms or whether they're downplaying their symptoms, whether they're defensive. It can even tell us whether they were confused on the test and tended to answer it in an inconsistent manner. So this allows us to either rely on the test results or not rely on it.
And in terms of these scales or sections, how many validity scales or sections are there?
There's roughly 9.
And with regard to the defendant, those 9 validity scales, what did they indicate?
It indicated that I was able to use the results of the test.
And what about the other scales? What is it that you're looking at with regard to the other scales or the other columns or whatever's involved?
Well, there's a number of different scales. There's a group of scales that are called the clinical scales, which are the primary areas that I looked at. I looked at the whole test, but those are the most important.
How many scales are there that you designated or that are designated as clinical scales?
There's 10.
So, and that's the ones that you focused on, right?
I looked at all of them, but that's the one I'm discussing now, yes.
And why is that one important to you, these clinical scales, these 10 scales?
There's this term called face validity, meaning that when you look at items on a test, if it has high face validity, you're able to read it and know what you're being asked in terms of what it would relate to. So for example, I cry all the time would clearly be related to depression. It has high face validity. So with this test, it tends to have lower face validity, and the validity indicators capture the test taker's approach for those clinical scales. So it tells me, again, whether they are being honest or not on this test.
And these clinical scales with regard to the defendant, what did they tell you, these 10 clinical scales?
The results of her MMPI were interesting in that, again, there's 10 clinical scales. What I typically see when I administer this test is that there is 1, 2, maybe even 3 what we call elevations, meaning that their score went above 65. Again, as I mentioned earlier, that's the threshold in which we as psychologists know that it's kind of like a tap on the shoulder that tells us this means it's clinically relevant, that there's something going on in this domain.
So the cutoff or the threshold for these scales, these 10 scales that we're talking about, is the number 65, right?
That is correct.
And if it's above 65, it's something that is worth looking at again because it may indicate something. Is that correct?
That's correct.
All right, so go ahead. What else did you see?
So what I found is, again, there's 10 scales. What I found is that 7 of the 10 scales were above that threshold. The majority of them were above that threshold.
So 7 of the 10 were above, of the clinical scales were above the threshold, right?
That's correct.
So what does that mean to you now that you've read some of the materials, you've then had the clinical interview, you've administered these other tests, and now you're doing the MMPI, and you have this elevation on 7 of the 10 scales or areas. What did that tell you?
Because there were 7 scales that were elevated, what that means is there was a lot of data for me to look at. There was a lot of personality indicators, signs of psychopathology that were then present. So the way that that is typically handled when there are that many elevations is that I then examined the top 2 and 3 scales that were the highest. And I was able to interpret those scales into meaningful personality characteristics.
So the top 2 or 3 scales that you interpreted, what did they relate to?
The top 3 scales indicate that people with this personality profile tend to experience a lot of aggressiveness, hostility, defensiveness. But interestingly, these individuals do a relatively good job on a day-to-day basis of not displaying it to people. So this isn't someone who's walking around consistently hostile, throwing things where it's visible to other people, but they're still experiencing those emotions inside. In times when they feel like they've been wronged in some sort of way, or when someone has done something to hurt them that they perceive as hurting them in any kind of way, the way that it's described in the literature is they have these violent outbursts that are described as seething, as very angry. And what they tend to do, what this profile suggests, is that these individuals tend to externalize blame. So for example, I acted out this way because that person deserved it. So they externalize it. They say, it's not my fault. I didn't act this way because I have these strong emotions inside. I act this way because someone did something to me. That's how they're able to conceptualize it and justify it in their mind.
And so in this case, the defendant's scores or on the scales indicated that, if I understood it, that she internalized the anger. Would that be fair or not?
Objection, speculation. This was a general scale, not specific to Ms. Arias.
All right, we're going to take the noon recess at this time. Ladies and gentlemen, please be back in the jury room at 1:25. We will start promptly at 1:30. Please remember the admonition. You are excused. Counsel, please approach.